And now for some final considerations. We've covered a lot of ground in this course. There's still a lot more that you can dig into very, very deeply, as we know that SharePoint is a very large beast with lots of different situations that you can be looking at. So let's kind of do a quick little review of what the courses should have gotten you and some of the different concepts that should be reinforced a bit. SharePoint has many different configurations, usages, and the development models reflect that. We've actually talked about three primary ways that SharePoint can be configured: on-site, hosted, or cloud. These are very, very broad canvases, and inside of each one of these are very different configurations. We haven't talked anything about the various server farms that can be done in hosted and on-site. We haven't talked about kind of the different structures that can be happen with federated between Office 365 and on-site or hosted, and how all of these can come together. A lot of this is kind of those separate modes, but know that as you're working with the SharePoint development models, you may need to work with more than one way of putting all of this together. You may have process people that work in SharePoint Designer to create your workflows, then have developers package those up into solutions so you can have them repeatable. Maybe even have your UX people or your JavaScript people working on the Napa type SharePoint apps to be able to have those in a Office 365 to support something on site. There are lots and lots of different ways to mix and match this together to make all of the SharePoint cogs work in a very smooth and easy fashion. Just think about that. Try and put it as simple, make things work independently fairly well, but know that use the lists and the SharePoint data as connecting points between all of your different solutions that you're going to be putting together. To create that successful application, you need to consider the context and the appropriate models. So if you have people that are in sister organizations or maybe customers that are coming in, think about how they're going to get to that. What are the hosting? What are the firewall rules? What are the DNS entries? There are a lot of these pieces that you may need to actually duplicate functions between several of these pieces. So if you're internal and you're not doing SharePoint app hosting for your on-sites, but you are doing in Office 365, you may need to have that same kind of base library shared between two different types of SharePoint apps so that you can make it all work together. Just think about that as you go to. As you move forward in this. Don't neglect keeping it simple, but also know that there may need to be some flexibility in how you put everything together to really make it work correctly. Hosted and SharePoint deployments, definitely on the rise. Know that this is the direction that Microsoft seems to be going. Don't just kind of say, well, we'll never put anything in the cloud and don't worry about it. As things move forward, there's going to be more and more push to the app model rather than the solutions model. There's going to be a lot more emphasis on moving into the browser and actually into the client, if at all possible. SharePoint is very interested in moving as much third-party code off of the server as possible. That means from an infrastructure point of view, it means things are a lot simpler. From a security model, it makes things a lot simpler. Just all the way around, the easier way to keep the server as solid and as supportable as possible is to have that code move off somewhere else. That again, the app model also means that there are more opportunities to develop against SharePoint. Being able to write SharePoint apps in whatever language you want and whatever runtime you're interested in also is very valuable for a lot of organizations. So as this comes forward, a lot of organizations are still looking at the on-site, and on-site will continue to be a very valid platform. But don't neglect that as things move forward, the cloud story is going to be a larger and larger slice of the SharePoint pie. That being said, it's not just basically making sure that your SharePoint works for you, but opening up SharePoint apps in the SharePoint store means that you have opportunities to expand out your capabilities. If you are a B2B organization, traditionally you're looking at your apps internally. If you have partners that are working with SharePoint in the cloud, SharePoint on Office 365, being able to open up, being able to create apps in the store and open those up to your partners to put on their own implementations becomes a very interesting scenario. Being able to work with organizations that are maybe sister organizations inside the same company as kind of partially firewalled off external companies becomes a balance of keeping the consistency across those pieces, but be able to do some of the firewalls that a lot of organizations like to do, being able to specialize and provide that support across boundaries without having a lot of things leak back and forth. So don't just look at the cloud offerings as a way to get your apps out of your data center, but also a way to get your apps into other people's SharePoint implementations and take advantage of that. When you're working with these SharePoint apps, basically manage your scope. Identify the level of your application. Is it internal only? It's office store deployments, department level management, organizational governance. All of these really kind of help guide you in the direction of the platform and how you're going to approach it. If you're looking at something that can be handled with workflow, that's a very light touch deployment. That's something that really lends itself to being maintained fairly easily and giving you lower levels of development involvement. If it's something that needs to be worked on the administrative side, if your ops guys need something, you kind of know that you're opening up and you have the capability to create SharePoint solutions and put all of those in place. So you've got a lot of opportunity there. If you're looking at something that goes in the Office store, now you're actually looking at, can it all be run in the browser itself, or is this something that's going to require some server resource backends to work with some hostings? Think about that as you go through there, and now you can actually kind of start slicing apart the building blocks and the support that you need and really make it all work successfully. And then know what your target audience is. SharePoint apps are really focused on that end users, making sure that it's working well. I've mentioned a lot about operations and getting that code off of the server, but on the flip side, getting the code as close as possible to the end user means that you're going to have a much richer, more responsive front end for your SharePoint implementation. And the more responsive the SharePoint implementation can be, the better you're going to have pickup on from the end user. The more that they can see, the more things happen there. The more resources you're going to be able to dedicate to that user to make sure that they get a very good experience. The workflows are automation tools, governance, site management, but don't neglect being able to put those in place as actual applications, to be able to have lists that do business logic in workflows, to be able to push these through, to have asynchronous processing, to be able to have message queues and work queues and ticketing and things like that. And then the SharePoint packages, administrative functions, make sure it's in there, and then create new SharePoint capabilities. Basically, you can push out those capabilities in SharePoint solutions and then use the apps to make use of those capabilities for the end user functionality. So it balances out. Each one of these pieces supports the rest, but know where that audience is and how you're going to put it into play.